This car's been with the customer for a year and a half now, and we've never really gone into depth on the build process, the design process, the tech specs. So I was able to borrow it to take to an event and then come and shoot this little section. This is a 1970 Series 2A that we fully restored, ground up, and of course electrified. As you can tell, it's not a stock heritage Land Rover colour palette or any of the individual 5 colours, maybe black as well, 6 colours. It's something very particular, and while there's a lot to talk about from the electrical side and all the standard parts that we fit that go into making up one of our sort of electric Land Rover kit, from brakes through to gauges through to other controls, the big story is really the design and what makes this such a recognisable car in, to be honest, not this scenario or setting. It spends most of its life in a city as a daily driver, as a commuting vehicle, which is the lovely thing that you can practically do once you electrify an old car. I guess the journey really started with just chatting to the customer around wanting to do something that stood out, that was different. And what could that mean, you know? And I sort of, it came up that perhaps a patchwork, like a multicolour scheme, and of course that Paul Smith Land Rover was a key reference. Like what an amazing car. I think that had obviously that colour palette is Paul Smith's signature. And it's also, some bumps here. And it's also, you know, I think it felt very right for a city. There was some fluoro elements. There was some, you know, some greys and blues and that kind of thing. Whereas this could, you know, this needed to feel something a little bit different and perhaps more Australian. When you drive an old Series Land Rover, no matter how many electric badges you put on it, you still get given sort of space and consideration on the road because everyone thinks you're a slow old car, which is actually it's like a nice experience. Actually, people are more, it's like you're they're just giving you this consideration when you're out driving, and everyone's less aggressive. And I don't know, it's a nicer, you bring the vibe of this car. It's sort of, there's a bubble around it, and just makes everything a bit of a nicer place to be. Ended up finding on Instagram a designer over in Argentina who just worked with those kind of colour palettes every day and has an amazing Instagram account that is physical items photographed in the sunshine, and they look like 3D renders, but they're all just about colour and shape layout. It's very cool.
Yeah, so my name is Eloisa Iturbe. I'm from Argentina. I'm a graphic designer. I grew up in the countryside and then moved to Buenos Aires to study graphic design.
So we're able to work with her and of course the customer on finding a palette that worked, identifying which panels would be which and how you'd get that together.
It was very interesting for me because it was like working with familiar color schemes, or the colors like I use, but applying them into a car. So it was like, okay, it was very interesting. And it was also interesting, the idea of patchwork, because it made me think about different ways of combining them. And the car had so many different panels and shapes. So it was, okay, so a little bit of this one, but a little bit of that one, and at the end, I wanted to look like harmonious.
And then that's back and forth to the paint shop, selecting these things that kind of match, going from screen through to perhaps a Pantone selection, more of a some ruts here, through a Pantone selection, and then into a, matching it with the actual paint colours from our paint supplier. The big challenge with something like this is doing it in a way that is harmonious together. Each of these colours individually is a little bit, you wouldn't want your whole car in one of these colours necessarily, maybe one or two of them, but together they work. And the challenge is when you're painting a Land Rover is you're often doing it in pieces. And so you go to whole body panel back and you're like, don't know about this colour. And that was the challenge in the workshop, as people just understanding the dream, but as the pieces came back, maybe not quite in love with it. But as we started to assemble, that was the key moment that it was really apparent that we kind of had something, that this together was quite an amazing and lovely car. And obviously it's loving this car is subjective in a way, but we found like an incredible support, I guess, for it, which is pretty cool. We sourced this car off of Land Rover Heaven, which you might be familiar with, but it is a property in a secret location in New South Wales that has an incredible collection of classic Land Rovers of all eras. Came from them in a very different colour and a very different state than it looks now. And the first thing we do is then tear it completely down to every part. You see I'm driving past this solar array, so maybe it's a good time to talk about energy usage. With the 53 kilowatt hour battery pack that's in this car, so that's our first generation system, we now do 55 kilowatt hours or 110 kilowatt hours in any wheelbase Land Rover. But this amount of power through this motor and this gearbox, which there's actually a lot of sort of energy loss through that, that'll give up to 250 kilometers of range, particularly when you're driving around town or off-road. Electric motors love that. They love that. They're efficient all the time. Petrol motors, diesel motors are efficient in a very narrow amount of time. So it almost is it confuses you in the way that you sort of think about the fuel economy, because a petrol motor gets incredible fuel economy on the highway because it's at its perfect happy power band, but terrible when it starts stop and it's accelerating and it's all through its rev range. An electric motor is just kind of the same all the time. And so it just uses more when you're going faster and it's pushing against the wind. That's the big factor. So when you're going fast, the wind is the problem. So when you're in a car that has a drag coefficient of about 0.62, I think it is, if you look that up, and what that means and what a modern car is, it is terrible. It is worse than I think it's actually worse than like a perfect cube. This is, all the little protrusions and shapes are not designed for aerodynamics. They're actually wind resistance. So anything above 80, in any vehicle, above 80 kilometers an hour, all that effort, most of your effort is pushing the wind, not moving the car anymore. The dash is a combination of old and new, and I'm going to talk about it while I pull away because there's some horse floats coming in behind me that want my space. Basically all the switches, there's a lot of old-timey stuff, original spec switches, ignition barrel, they're all talking to our PDM. So basically the computer that runs the 12-volt system of the car, the logic system of the car. That means that, a spotlight switch is sending a command to the computer that's also checking then, are the high beams on, because spotlight's only allowed when high beams are also triggered, and then sending the power out to the spotlight plug, and therefore the spotlights. The gauges look old in a certain way because we have recreated the original Smith's typeface, and therefore the gauge faces that sort of blend old and new. Of course, a original Land Rover didn't have an amp draw in the hundreds of amps, which is essentially now our economy gauge. The more that you accelerate, the more energy is pulled from the battery, the more you're drawing. And when you decelerate, or charge the car, but when you decelerate and regen braking is on, the mass of the vehicle is energy, of course. It's going through the rear wheels and turning the motor into a generator, and therefore putting, I guess, negative amps, but energy back into that battery. Down below we have some smaller gauges that show battery state of charge from full to empty, of course, a clock, and then we use some new buttons as well throughout this, as well as these original kind of Lucas switches. We use some buttons for the drive mode, off-road mode, on-road mode, warning lights, camp mode, which basically, I've done a video on this before, but triggers the high voltage system to then power the 12 volt system without the key needing to be in the car. Won't let you drive it, but does let you charge a phone, run a fridge, do all of those things. A giant second battery, right? Then we have hazard and cabin lights. Cabin lights is a fun one because in one of these hard tops, we can run a warm white LED strip around the outside and give a really nice ambience to it. And also do some fun things, again, because we're running through the PDM, that mean we can do stuff like when you turn the car off, these lights come on for 30 seconds and then fade out. Like a modern car, like any modern car. So some of these features are not, it's not that we're automotive design geniuses. It's just that we want to do things that make these cars feel a bit normal. You'll see I've got some nice self-cancelling indicators, and they're a little bit more modern than they would have been. It's a consideration for us that we're not just making the throttle pedal better in terms of, you know, there's an electric motor connected to that, so of course the throttle's going to be more responsive. How do we make a better car? And that's the, and how do we make all those upgrades feel like one collective unit, that one is an extreme and one's poor or whatever it might be? So that's a consideration when we do any of our kits, whether that's for Porsche or Mini or now Land Rover, that we're bundling up all the pieces of that puzzle that we've tested and that work together and that feel right together as well. So that you're not just, you don't have, you know, one of these two or three, in this case, pedals, or the switch gear isn't right, that becomes the, I guess we often like to call it like, it's what you imagine these old cars to be rather than what they exactly are. And, you know, that is a lot of, that doesn't mean everything's, I don't want to say the best it can be. Everything's fit for purpose, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily the most extreme. So having a boosted brake system and disc brakes on the front gives us that brake feel that people are expecting. It's much, much better than stock, but it is not a modern sports car or even a modern hatchback. In twitchiness, it feels appropriate for this car. So there's a lot where we're staying true to original spec, and then there's a lot of things that we're doing from a design perspective or a functional perspective that we think makes the car better or makes the car better suited to that customer. On this car, obviously, we've got a smaller steering wheel, Exmoor trim wheel in the wood, a little jaunt badge in the centre, a smaller diameter wheel, just nicer, gives more space to the car in the cab, right? And it feels better to drive. It's you don't need it because you've got power steering. You don't need the bigger diameter to help you give you leverage. We do a few little things. Obviously, we've got seat belts, lap sash, inertia reel seat belts, ADR approved belts, better mounting for all points. So uprated mounting for the inertia reel for the third point or the second point up here, increased strength and additional plating on where the buckles mount in rather than just through the sheet metal. So we do plating underneath. We do a lot of little touches and some interesting things. Obviously, the fuel cap is where the electric vehicle charger is. The finish on that is actually an original, is kind of a, we basically let it surface rust a little bit and then put a clear coat on. And there's a few other areas on the car where that we've let some surface rust happen and then clear coat, because basically that surface rust is a perfect fit to the color palette of this car. Some other nice convenience things, it's got the cat flap tailgate, so, you know, one up, one down. Those originally had, I guess, just big metal rods that held the top section up. And it's quite a heavy thing. There's a bit of steel and glass in it, obviously. Has gas struts on that now, which make that a lot more usable, make it a one-hand operation if you're wanting to put shopping in there. You'll see quite prominently we're running, there's a mud terrain tyre on the bonnet. There's mud terrain tyres on all four corners as well. Mud terrain and electric vehicle are not often used together in a sentence, let alone on a car. These are not the tyres for efficiency in any way, but they are the tyres that are most appropriate for this build. The consideration was that it was never about range. It was about building the funnest car that makes you the most happy that it can, is the best expression of, I don't know, Land Rovers and fun and mixed up colour palette and all these kinds of things. The spare on the bonnet is a funny thing. It obviously kind of impedes vision, but you don't notice it. Like, I can still see each corner of the front of the car. Like, I have better four-wheel drive visibility than almost any other car that I could buy today. I just kind of have this tyre there. Gives me more space in the back. I don't need to open the engine because, well, what am I doing in there? It's an electric system that really doesn't need any maintenance except topping up kind of wiper fluid and checking levels every now and then. So it's not too much of a problem, even though it is heavy. So yeah, tyres that work against economy, but are definitely more fun and more capable in certain situations. Basically, let's say it is an adjustable seating system, but you get to adjust it once, and that is at time of manufacture. So we can do different thicknesses of foam on the backrests or the seat bases, depending on your proportions. And then, so I like, for example, I would take a slightly thinner rear foam so I can get a bit more legroom. Anyway, I still like the seating position. And then wrapped in a new leather, of course, the leather catalogue called this avocado. I like to call it eucalypt. It sounds a little bit better and perhaps more in theme with the vehicle. So we take that same leather and we do a few little touches. Door cards, of course, which allows to put some soundproofing behind them, and a few little accents on the chain guards and a few other areas where we can pick up some of that leather. It works and I love it. Is the short answer, and it's very fun to drive around. Obviously, you stand out. You stand out in a series Land Rover anyway in the city these days, but particularly in this color palette.
But it's funny that now I recognize Land Rovers because of the handles, because of the wheels. So there I'm on the street and I said to my husband, "Oh, that's a Land Rover." That's a Land Rover. Because I recognize it. So I work so in detail with the car and it's very easy for me to recognize it now. That's fun.
We've got you now. It's like so many people who start working here and they know Land Rovers, they've heard of it. But now, yeah, the little, that hinge detail, that means it's this year and this, it's in your brain forever and you see them out the corner of your eye.
Yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
I just heard you come in, I was like, yeah, that doesn't sound like a Rover.
It doesn't sound right. Yeah, exactly. No, so we build these. So this is a customer's car that I'm just shooting a little video about it.
Not that guy, Is it four-wheel drive?
Yeah.
Cool.
So this is electric motor into the original transmission.
Yep.
So We do ones that are fully auto now as well, but it means you've got crazy off-road ability, and you change gears. Like I'd drive pulling out onto the road there, I'd take off in second and I'd change to fourth, and that's it, kind of thing.
It has gears.
Yeah, it has gears. Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool. Keep up the good work.
Cheers. Thanks very much.
Nice.
You create a patchwork electric Land Rover. All those things, patchwork car, electric car, classic Land Rover, you're bound to get stopped for either one of those things. You put them all together, you're going to get stopped. People see the car, obviously it stands out, and then they hear it or don't hear it. There is noise, of course. We've got mud terrain tyres and those sort of things, but it's a, let these guys pass. But it is a talking point. We also put electric badges on the side because we realised that in traffic, pulled up at lights, you're hearing the engine noise from all the other cars. You don't necessarily notice how quiet, well, this one isn't making the noise at that time. So we made sure we put in a little electric badge on the side so everyone's aware. Australians are a bit hesitant to say hi. When you trigger enough points, though, people are like, oh, okay, I've got to chat. Why don't you chat, right? They're keen to understand a bit more how this stuff works. And that's the point for us, right, was to show that electric vehicles can be a lot more than just, a luxury sedan, a quirky hatchback. We've got a broader range now, but we still don't have any four-wheel drives. So showing that an electric car can be a true off-road four-wheel drive, mud terrain tyres, everything built in this car that does not make sense for normal electric vehicle considerations. Range, aerodynamics, silence, all these things. No, this is a work vehicle, as pretty as the paint job might be. Starts to change people's perception and gets them excited about the electrification of everything, right?